To honor the fact that Night Spirit has most likely quit YouTube since he hasn't uploaded in a while, I am narrating this story. If you saw my other narration I did of his, be sure to check that out. Now, with that being said, let us begin. My family has a terrible curse that caused me to live in constant anxiety. We're butchers. We don't run a national corporation for it or anything, but our quality has been inconceivable. 5-star Google reviews, top word of the mouth. We would probably even have a Michelin star if it weren't for the possible places other than restaurants. Somehow we have been able to produce the most delicious, soft, melting meats, better than the Wagyu beef. But the story of how it came to be and how it is not a happy-go-lucky out as our service. My family has been butchers for hundreds of years, even the last name being Butcher, and somehow we have not changed professions since we are given. Let me clarify that is my story. My explanation for why I wish I was dead, yet I don't want to die. But I must first tell you the story of my ancestor. I'm not sure exactly how long ago this was, but the story goes that it was during the medieval ages. His father or grandfather always kept honesty and as a top shop's moral framework. Because of this, they were often choice meat shop for even lords and ladies of the nearby lands, until one day when a new shop opened up. My ancestors were not worried, because their shop was so successful, the shop did not make a sale for days. However, on one day no more than special than any other, a town drunk somehow found himself on another shop, thinking it was my ancestor's family shop. He ordered a cut of leg meat, drunkenly swaggered it home, and fell into the booze-induced slumber. The next day he cooked the meat and ate it, and came home running into town, directly into our shop. He asked what he had ordered from his drunken stupor, and it was almost salivating. Most delectable meat he had ever eaten. The family had told him that he did not visit the shop yesterday at all, and they realized that it had been another shop by mistake. My family had said there was no way it could have been the other shop, so they went over as a group grandfather, father, son, and drunk. They went with the shopkeeper of what was ordered, and they simply gestured to the stack of cubed meat on display with furrowed brows. My family had purchased the cube and immediately went back to cook it. After doing so, they realized they would cook any of their own product, as the cooked meat was placed on their tongues. Within seconds, they realized they had to keep other shops' meat a secret from the rest of the town. They were told drunk that they must never tell anyone about the shop's quality of meat, and he promised not to. But a drunk would not be drunk if they did not yell secrets to the entire town were blinded by booze. It did not take long for people to hear about the other shop and its miraculous tasting meat. My ancestor's butcher shop was in danger of closing within weeks. The son could not stand to see his family at such a low point. Being the youngest at 16, he wanted to prove that he was helpful to the family. He began spying on the other shopkeeper, in hopes of figuring out their secret of the delicious cubes. Their methods, from what the son could see, all seemed to be normal. But every weekend they would take their wagon out of town. The son was not sure where, as he was not able to stealthily follow beyond the trees and buildings. He asked his father and grandfather for permission to follow, and was firmly told no, that doing so would be a terrible thing, and that there were honest people, and that God would help them eventually. God did not. Another week later, the father grew ill. Without his labor, the shop grew even less profitable, and could not afford the things they need to help him get better: food, medicine, and time. The son could not bear it. That weekend there was a new moon. It was the best opportunity for him to sneak into the wagon. In the dark of the night, he endured the long, bumpy ride of his wooden cage until they had arrived. As soon as the wagon stopped, voices could be heard, but it was indiscernible of what they were saying. The sun peeked out of the cover and saw two figures holding into a building. It all became quiet. He slipped out of the wagon and made his way, as slyly as he could, into the same building. Inside, he saw the two figures carrying a bloody wrapping of meat. Finally, the son had discovered the source of the delicious carcasses, the shopkeeper's supplier, and the two figures repeated this several times, and when the one just turned inside, he knew he had to get back in the wagon before it took off to his hometown. Just as he exited out of the building, the horses began trotting. He sprinted as fast as he could, the sound of his footsteps hidden by the horses, and jumped into the wagon right before his leg muscles would have reached their physical limit. The ride back was not bumpy. He did not feel as if being a wooden cage anymore, but a bed of gold. When they had finally made their way home, he wrapped a leg of lamb in his shirt, jumped out of the side opposed to the shopkeeper, and quickly made his way home. He let out a shout of joy when he entered his home. It was a shout that his entire family had heard, which caused them to gather. He told them this story and showed the wrapped meat. Although his grandfather was not entirely on board, his sister and mother were jumping for joy. They knew that his meat was good for future for them all, and could afford the father's care. The son quickly unwrapped his treasure, and caliphony of joy had ended. The son had not grabbed a leg of lamb, but a human limb. His grandfather immediately yelled at him for what he had brought into their house. He took the meat and went to start a fire outside, in order to burn the meat before anyone had found out about it. His sister comforted their mother, who was crying. The son felt great shame and went to his bed. After a long and well-needed from his escapades of the night before, he rested and woke up to the sounds of people gathering around the busy shop, their own. He asked what had happened, and the family told him that they had spoke a great deal after he had gone to sleep. They had all decided they needed to do this, and even the grandfather. They cooked the limb, and the family had told them, after trying some of the forbidden meat, called in favor to the lords that they had previously sold to. This piece of meat was given to the king, and the word had spread quickly. Their shop had meat that the king himself put orders for. They had made their king supplier. My father stopped the story at this point. The thought of it was strange, but simply a folk tale. The family legend. He then showed me something I would never have imagined, and what would work on every morning. While I was asleep, he had done an excellent job never to reveal the family secret. Every morning before the street's animals would wake, my father would chop, skin, fillet, boil, and prepare various flesh. Human flesh. I was sick. I felt like I was to blame. He wanted to continue this horrible tradition. He needed to kill people for my sake, to pay my tuition, for the constant medical bills, to make sure we stayed healthy, to pay every other bill we needed to live. I couldn't take this burden. I couldn't take with the fact that my father was a murderer. I panicked and ran away. When I saw my dad next, I had to hear the rest of the story, even though my dad was a killer. I knew he wouldn't kill me, because I was his reason for doing so in the first place. He was paying for us to have a good life. He continued the story. Here is the important part. The grandfather, in order to meet the new demand for the shop's meat, went to the other shopkeeper and explained the situation. He apologized for what the son had done, but insisted that he needed to access the supplier. He wouldn't ask how the supplier had such fresh bodies, and he would even cut the other shopkeepers in for a 50-50 split of the money. He explained that it was needed because his own son was ill, and they had to afford the medical care and supplies. Even with the 50-50 split, they would be able to afford it, thanks to all the new demand. The shopkeeper was firm with their denial of request. The grandfather persisted, explaining how they absolutely needed this to help the son out, who was in the main laborer of the family. The shopkeeper once again disagreed. The grandfather asked if I could purchase all of the stock that the shopkeeper had been right there. The shopkeeper denied any sale to him. In his desperation, he pushed the shopkeeper out of the way. He must have been a very strong man, or perhaps very desperate, because the shopkeeper was knocked back into the wall, their head striking it with a cracking sound. The grandfather, ignoring this, pushed this on a mission grabbing as many bags of meat as he could carry. As he was carrying them out of the store, the shopkeeper told him that for doing this, his wish would be granted. His son would be able to work to provide the family for his age and allow him to. The grandfather, after stopping to hear this, simply turned away and continued the family shop. What our family didn't know about the shopkeeper was that they were a witch, one who had cursed the family in a strange way and did not manifest until the witch was long gone. The day after the grandfather had stolen the bags of meat, his son miraculously recovered. He went on from coughing blood, having a high fever, chills and aches, to no symptoms whatsoever. But what seemed to be a blessing turned out to be a part of the shopkeeper's curse. The father had no symptoms of this terrible ailment to his entire life, until he became too old to continue working. The day after he retired, he felt a strange sensation in his throat. He started sweating, mucus dripping from his nostrils, then pouring. He then violently coughing blood. It was said that he had exclaimed between gasps of life that his head was on fire, that it felt like his insides were being replaced by thorns, cutting him apart. He had died almost a violent death. The family speculated that this must have been the witch's curse, based on what the grandfather had told them the way back when he took the meat. This was apparently a fitting explanation for the time period. With the death of the father, they began to worry. They wondered if they were too cursed, ultimately possibly as a way of easing their racing minds. They decided that it was the father who would this effect. They believed that the witch's curse was over his death. It was not. As soon as every person stopped working, they died incredibly grotesque death. Over the years, things have discovered about the curse that would happen again regardless if the person ever actually retired. Once they reached their retirement age, they were at risk of giving them a horrific end, and it did not matter if they spent their lives working until a certain point. If they tried to end their lives, the curse would take them, even more horrific fashion than others. If they tried to show that this would happen to anyone else, it would take them before they were able to. There was no way to avoid it, or show that it existed, those outside the family. It was eventually discovered that the accumulation of pain throughout the person's life would be inflicted upon hundredfold onto them whenever the curse was activated. Ancestors who had been injured in wars would have received the most extreme, unbearable, searing hot pains in places that they were shot or stabbed. Those who had only broken bones their lives would feel as if their bones were being on the ground into powder. Any scrapes would feel like sandpaper was being rubbed over and over and over onto their open flesh. The only way to avoid this was seen with those who had lived their lives without much injury or illness. They would not experience as terrible of an ending. However, this is easier said than done. To avoid all injuries, aches, and pains, and more of the entire life is not an easy task. Not a single person of my lineage had died peacefully on their deathbed, and they have all died the most horrific deaths ever imaginable, save for the lucky few who were able to shelter life. My father explained that this is why he had always watched me like a hawk. This is why our medical bills were so high, beyond the average person's yearly checkups. He said that he always tried his best to make sure I was safe and healthy growing up. But what parent doesn't? I didn't realize the gravity of the situation, and he didn't want to scare me as a child, or to ruin my childhood, by living completely sheltered life. This was his way of going about this, and he said he did the best he could without jeopardizing my having a normal life. He didn't want me to live too scared to do anything. Now that I was older and mature enough to see his eyes and understand without it completely destroying my worldview, he told me he was wrong. There was no way I would ever be able to be okay with his learning truth. He would never foreseen the possibility outcomes. This is why I wish I was dead, but I don't want to die. Growing up, I had managed to stay safe and healthy thanks to his precautions, but now death will be too painful. Everything I learned about my family didn't matter to me at this point. I just wish my dad had told me before. I didn't want to hear anything he had to say, but like I mentioned before, I had to. It's not like I could wheel my own bed anyway, much less past nurses. I already couldn't handle the pain. I wish my attempt was successful.